Hello all, welcome to our panel, Green May, Red May, Ecological and Worker Struggles After the Plague Year. We want to welcome everyone who is joining us and our panelists today. Certainly we have comrades here from the East Coast, and it's heading into early afternoon there. Those of us on the West Coast are still having our morning coffee, and of course really appreciate comrades from around the world who are watching this live, and then of course watching this in the days, weeks, and years to come via the Common Notions YouTube channel. What I'm going to do briefly here is just introduce our panelists. Then we'll get right to it. After about 15-20 minutes of each panelist commenting on some of the prompt and questions that we have today, we'll move for about a half-an-hour session of questions in between the panelists, and of course anything coming in from both the YouTube channel or via email and text and the like. So thank you for joining us. I do want to begin by stating that our title, Green May, Red May, Ecological and Worker Struggles After the Plague Year, in a lot of ways is a homage to Peter's wonderful essay, originally written in 1986, and then of course published by PM Press as a full book a few years ago. This of course is the incomplete, true, authentic, and wonderful history of May Day. I and many, many others have encountered this essay over the years. I personally return to it at the beginning of every May to remind me of the intertwining ecological and worker struggles that have marked May, and allow us, of course, an opportunity to reflect on said struggles. So in a lot of ways, to begin with that particular essay and a question from it, Peter asks, where is the green and red today? And we're asking that not just in the context of this last plague year, but in the last 500 years of ecological and worker struggles. So look forward to getting into some of that with the panelists. Joining us today, of course, is Peter Linebaugh. He's an American Marxist historian who specializes in British history, Irish history, labor history, and the history of the colonial Atlantic. He is a member of the Midnight Notes Collective, and with author, of course, Marcus Rediker of the absolutely spectacular, of the Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and Hindu History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. He's also author, of course, of The London Hanged, the Magna Carta Manifesto, and most recently, Red Round, Globe Hot Burning, a tale at the crossroads of commons and closure, of love and terror, of race and class, and of Kate and Ned Despard. And of course, we look forward to hearing Peter's reflections on that and our questions before us. Next up, we'll have Eleanor Finley, as a writer, speaker, municipalist, and PhD candidate in anthropology. Her writing appears in outlets such as Roar Magazine, In These Times, and Open Democracy. She's been active building Symbiosis, a network of organizations building radical municipalism across North America. Next up, we'll have a wonderful collective by the name of Out of the Woods, and Kai is joining us from them today. Of course, their recent Common Notions title is Hope Against Hope, Writings on the Ecological Crisis. And of course, that is going to address this intersection between the green and the red. Out of the Woods is a transnational political research and theory collective, decolonial, small c communist, anti-racist, queer feminist thinkers working together to think through the problem of ecological crisis. Also, Common Notions authors in a collective by the name of CounterPower, and Johnny and Caitlin will be joining us from them. They are a revolutionary organization committed to building the power of working and oppressed peoples from below and to the left. My name is Kevin Van Meter. I'm really excited to be joining you all as your moderator and host today. This is being hosted, in fact, by Common Notions publishers. For more information, and of course, for the two titles by our collectives today, you can go to commonnotions.org. And Making Worlds Bookstore, which is based in Philadelphia. And we thank Malav, who's behind the scenes, of course, and taking care of all our technological issues and limitations and problems and the like. And I look forward to questions and comments coming through via YouTube and other channels. For free to contact us via our Facebook page and, of course, via YouTube. And we'll filter those into our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Peter Linebaugh.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. I'm new to the other panelists, and so I'm not as familiar with their work, and I look forward to learning more about it today. And your opening question, where is the red and green today? I'm going to need to think about, maybe through the conversations we're having. But I don't have an easy answer for us right now. I think as a historian or as a people's remembrancer, I should just remind everybody of the red and the green May Day. And the first May Day here on Turtle Island transpired on May 1st, 1627. And it was a celebration of humans, of one another, by dancing around a maypole with Native Americans in Quincy, Massachusetts, with indentured servants, with perhaps some slaves who had escaped. It was already a rainbow coalition, and it was both gay and it was straight. We know this from a large amount of investigation that was produced in order to justify the terrorist massacre of the participants, which was led by the Puritans of Boston. And that transpired and put an end to that coalition, at least as it was expressed on May Day. For me, I've symbolized that May Day as the Green May Day, to contrast it with the, quote, Workers' May Day of 1886, when on May 1st, the iron molders went on strike for the 8-hour day. And their strike was met by terror, this time by Chicago police, who shot and killed 4. In utter horror at this massacre, the working class of Chicago called for a mobilization at Haymarket. And that took place, and a bomb was thrown, a police was killed, others were killed, and all hell broke out. And the rest of the world, well, 4 people were hanged subsequent for throwing dynamite with no evidence. Albert Parsons, August Spies, Fisher, Engel. And the rest of the world, to prevent that hanging, began May Day as we know it and as we still celebrate it as a workers' holiday. When I say we, I mean everybody except those of us still on Turtle Island. May Day was not celebrated in the USA, except as a green holiday for children. As a workers' holiday for the shorter working week, it was, as I say, the rest of the world. Instead, the USA separated itself from that international working class by making Labor Day in September a day for labor. And instead, May Day itself, they turned, in their dastardly upside-down irrationality, they called it Law Day. I'd like to go back for a minute to those iron molders. They are the ones who made the McCormick Reaper, the reaper that cut the grain on the prairies of Turtle Island. This grain now belonged to a world food market and capitalist agribusiness. It was being mechanized. Those iron molders were those responsible for the creating of the machine, but those responsible for shaving and lathering up, for expropriation of the huge fertile lands of Native America and turning it into what will become a dust bowl, was a capitalist class. Okay, the second thing I want to say to everybody is I'm speaking a few days after a worldwide day of resistance last Saturday, when, in response to the militarization and slaughter of the occupation by Zionist powers of Palestine. Here in Ann Arbor, from where I speak, thousands of Arab Americans originated in Yemeni, in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, Morocco, but especially Palestinian Americans, assembled as part of worldwide solidarity. And our chant was, from Detroit to Palestine, occupation is a crime. From Detroit to Palestine, occupation is a crime. What a great slogan. We were familiar with the occupation of Palestine, those of us in the movement for its liberation. But what of the occupation of Detroit? What did this mean? And Detroit is a city like Istanbul that is in between two large bodies of water. The waters here are fresh waters. In fact, the largest freshwater reserves on planet Earth, the Great Lakes. Detroit is at a key point in this water system. The native peoples of Turtle Island used to assemble in Detroit. The Seneca people from New York, hoping to make alliance with the Potawatomi, with the Hurons, to federalize a resistance to the settler invasion. They lost and were removed from Detroit. Those who occupy Detroit now, the Ford family, the capitalist auto class, depending on oil, and real estate developers. These are the settler occupiers now. Native people have been removed, but they have been removed, it's essential to see, not just to other parts of reservations in the Great Lakes, but to other parts of Turtle Island, like Oklahoma or Kansas. The Potawatomi and the Ojibwe people are at the forefront of opposition to Line 3 and to Line 5. These are pipelines to transport Alberta tar sands in Canada across the Prairie Center, through the Great Lakes, to Toledo, to Detroit for refining. And in doing so, they threaten the fresh waters of the world. Those who lead this are indigenous people, led by women, water protectors in Minnesota. So this is, now I'm beginning to bring together the themes of the energy crisis, the automobile civilization, which has brought us to the crisis of the planet, the ecological crisis that geologists call the Anthropocene, desertification, extinctions, the floods, the fires, and the plague. These are a result of this so-called, this barbaric civilization dependent on fossil fuels and the destruction of indigenous people. So when we shouted from Detroit to Palestine, occupation is a crime, those of us in the Great Lakes had to take this to heart. And the way we could express solidarity with Palestine is by solidarity with the indigenous people against Line 3 and Line 5. So that was just a couple of days ago. And I've just started to put these thoughts together and hope in our conversation we can, well, I look forward to hearing what others have to say. But have I passed my time? Or is there more time? Have people been able to hear me while I've been talking? Oh, it says, I see I've gone 15 minutes. I better stop. I can't hear anything.
Peter, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Technological difficulties, of course, with these. Thank you so much for your real deep historical analysis here and bringing that into really not just the present, but this very week. So we appreciate your comments. And Malav is going to transfer us over to Eleanor, who's going to speak next.
All right, there we go. I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you to Common Notions for organizing this really exciting event, for bringing this together, and also for reaching out to me to be a part of it. And I can't see anyone. I feel actually a bit sad not being able to see folks who are watching on the other side. But thank you to everyone who's taking their time to be part of this conversation and to be here with us. So my name's Eleanor Finley. I was really trying to think about how to introduce myself for this talk, because I feel like my identity has changed so much in the last year, particularly around the pandemic, and it feels like a lot of the old categories don't fit anymore. And I'm curious if my co-presenters have had that feeling as well, that a lot of the categories and modes of thinking that I had used to think about not only myself, but politics and political change have really been challenged by the pandemic. And I feel like I'm kind of like going back to scratch about so many of my ideas. But I'm a revolutionary. I've been dedicated to revolutionary politics really for the last decade or so. I am of the millennial generation that came up during or after the 2008 recession, and I participated in Occupy Wall Street. Actually, one of our other presenters, Johnny, we met there long ago. And for me at that time, I really became a dedicated revolutionary and also dedicated to the concept of confederal direct democracy. And so even though I can't really go into depth about that in my talk right now, that's always going to be in the background for me. In my bio, uses the word municipalism. That's sort of another way of thinking through participatory democracy at the grassroots level, and how that is somehow essential to solving the global ecological crisis. That those two things have to go hand in hand. That there's no solving the green, as we're putting it today, without solving, I mean, I guess you can think of it as the red, but without solving the social crisis that we have as well, that those dislocations come from the same place. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I've been a part of the Institute for Social Ecology, working with the ideas of Murray Bookchin, which I just mentioned. But in the last year, during the pandemic, I've been living in Italy with my partner, and I was a part of a collective writing project to create a book called Pandemic Solidarity that you maybe have seen around. And it's a survey of mutual aid organizing around the world. And that's really, sort of my main political work this past year. I also do some work with Word Magazine. So I feel like what I've gotten to see this past year in the pandemic year is kind of a survey of really mutual aid organizations and what people have been doing. And I had the honor of writing a chapter about Italy and looking at mutual aid organizing in Italy, particularly around social centers. And through that project, what we really found collectively was that people were doing the same thing all over the world under many different names, coming together organically to support one another when suddenly acquiring food was problematic for many people, when suddenly work was gone, when suddenly huge sectors of our population were at immediate risk. And now, 1 year later, we're at a very different moment with the pandemic. It's still going on. I think we should keep that in mind, particularly in North America, I think, or Turtle Island. We're starting to think that this is over. And it's understandable to want to get back to normalcy. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that this disease isn't going anywhere. There are literally tens of thousands of people dying in India every day, and around the world, and that the struggle is still very much going on. At any rate, when we were writing Pandemic Solidarity about mutual aid projects forming a year ago, as I mentioned, we found that people sort of instinctively knew what to do in times of crisis, and that instinct overcame ideological divisions and social divisions, and that they instinctively worked together in a horizontal way. So as much as this has been a very dystopian experience, the pandemic this past year, all of the social dislocations and suffering that has come from it, there have been moments of utopia within it. And I think that's maybe somehow related to the themes and the topics that we're going to be discussing more in depth today. But for me, I think that as I reflect on, as I reflect on Peter's piece and the historical work that he's done, that there's something utopian about the celebratory May Day impulse, right? Like the Jubilee. And so I think as we're connecting these ideas and thinking about the last pandemic year, that there's something that we should be learning from the utopian moment inside this dystopian crisis. As I mentioned, I sort of wasn't, the past year has kind of blown apart so many of my preconceived notions. So I didn't come with like a ton of organized thoughts, but I did sort of go through the prompts that we were given as presenters, and I thought I'd even share these questions with everyone today, and I'm sure we'll get into them in the discussion. But as presenters, we were asked, for example, after this past year, how are you thinking about ecological and worker struggles? So I just shared some of that with you all. And as I asked myself this question, I realized that in many ways, my thinking hasn't changed, or rather my core values haven't changed. First of all, I think that I believe, I value that we are human beings living in community before we are workers, and that our labor is a part of our identity, but we exceed that identity. And as a consequence, in my own thinking, worker struggles ought to be embedded in community struggles. And they work best when they're embedded in community struggles. And I don't think anyone here would argue with that. But again, as I was reflecting on sort of these questions through the prism of the pandemic, something that came to mind for me is that many people have sort of suddenly come to realize this truth, that we are so much more than our jobs, that we are so much more than the work that we do, the labor we provide, whether that's to capitalism or whether that's in the service of the movement. Right? I think about burnout, how often people will drive themselves in very difficult ways as organizers, and struggle to feel that they, as individuals, have value unless they are hustling through the movement and doing absolutely everything all the time. And what we've seen this year is you can't address everything all the time. And also that we are so much more than any sort of work that we do or services we provide. That we're family members. we're grandchildren and cousins, we're friends, we're parents, we're, you know, caretakers of animals and even just the land around us. And if that sounds a little bit woo-woo, maybe it is. Maybe it's because I've been, you know, stuck at home myself for so long. But I really have seen a change in attitude, even among ordinary people. You know, my friends who aren't radical, my family who aren't radicalized. That people's attitudes towards work and labor is changing, and that clearly presents an opportunity for us. So that's one of, you know, that has been reinforced for me through the pandemic. One way my own thinking has really changed about labor through the pandemic is my optimism about the potential power of labor struggles in the gig economy. I expect that some of our other presenters are really going to go into this more deeply. But you look at the delivery drivers, the people working in distribution at Amazon. This isn't my area of expertise, but it's become rapidly evident that these people have their hands on the point of production, or rather reproduction, in a way that coal miners or textile workers might have had a century ago. And I think it's very clear at this point that that their struggles need to be attended to very, very carefully. Actually, as I mentioned, I've been living in Italy this past year, and just in the last few weeks, I returned home. So this is something I'm seeing in a very stark way because U.S. society in particular has changed so dramatically in such a short time. Before I move on, could I get a quick time check? How am I doing? Even if just somebody could write it in the chat, that would be great. I have a few minutes. Okay. So maybe I'm going to make one more point, which relates back to the work that me and my co-authors and collaborators discovered as we were working on the book Pandemic Solidarity, that looked at mutual aid organizing in response to COVID-19, as well as the health workers and nurses who were on the front lines of taking care of people, especially as the crisis was just emerging. And what we discovered is that overwhelmingly the people doing this work are women. And labor for women has transformed in so many ways through this pandemic. And I was kind of awestruck by how many of the people we were interviewing were women. How many of the nurses who were taking a stand at hospitals were and are women, and even just sort of that sudden realization as the pandemic was emerging that the professionals working in elder care facilities, they're overwhelmingly women, and they're overwhelmingly women of color. So the issue of women's work and sectors that have become feminized in the economy, or I guess really rather the service sector of the economy that just in recent decades has become a sector, has become commodified, has become proletarianized, that these kinds of care are suddenly, there's so much more than just jobs. They're about keeping ourselves and each other alive. And so really the importance of women's work and the importance of revisiting all of the major observations by Marxist feminists over the years is one way that I've been really rethinking the pandemic. And I know I want to not go over too much and let others talk, and hopefully we can also get into some discussion. But on this particular point about feminized labor and reproduction, is that labor has also changed so much at home. And I think we need to not lose this opportunity to really understand the importance of homemaking and caretaking. Some things that I've mentioned earlier: mothering, parenting, caring for your family members. Like I said, simply being a family member, it's real work, and at the same time, it's not labor in the capitalist sense of labor. And it's not an accident that we all in the past year have been instinctively participating in the revival of handicrafts, or learning pottery, baking, needlepoint, different kinds of craftsmanship, and again, ones that are feminized. Feminized crafts have been experiencing a huge revitalization and resurgence of interest, and I think it's not an accident, because we're beginning to really, even on an individual level, looking at where things come from ourselves, and not to sort of take things in an individualistic direction and say that, oh, we just need to produce things individually. No, but a lesson that we can take away from this past year is to revalorize the feminized aspects of our day-to-day lives, and to politicize them, and to make them a part of this green May, red May synthesis between the non-human and human parts of our world, between the ecological and the human and artificial parts of our world. I think that's very essential. And finally, that has a great deal to do with our own relationships with ourselves as individuals. And again, that's a very different kind of discourse that than what I often usually present. So I'm really excited to continue with you all. And thank you again very much for inviting me and being a part of this discussion together.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. A lot of really rich reflections we can bring into our discussion. And when you commented initially on your changes in identity, revisiting that's something that I have gone through in many different iterations the last year, and thinking, how am I going back to my core values? How am I organizing? What am I doing with my time in regards to building new worlds and fighting capitalism? And look forward to kind of digging into that a little bit more. So thank you for that. Next up, we're going to have Kai from Out of the Woods Collective. Their book, Hope Against Hope, Writings on Ecological Crisis, arrived in manuscript form from Olive, actually, prior to the book's publishing, and I was super impressed, and I've yet to hear you speak about it, so I'm quite excited to hear your reflections today and talk about your work and your collective's work. Thank you, Kai.
Thanks, all, and thanks to the comments from Peter and Eleanor. I think that what I'm going to say largely follows on, as well as kind of complicates the terrain a little bit. So my name is Kai. I live in Richmond. I'm part of this collective called Out of the Woods, which is a transnational thinking, research, and I guess political commentary group that's been around now almost for 10 years. We initially sort of formed to try to think the politics of the relationship between capitalism and the climate crisis, historically, theoretically, and politically. And since that time, since 2011, and we sort of started on a LibCon blog writing about some of these things, we've really evolved to take a more expansive look at the ways in which not just the climate crisis, but ecological crisis, much larger than that, terrifyingly, is a product of racial capitalism and coloniality, and consequently requires different sorts of left and communist strategies for overcoming it. And so in our book, Hope Against Hope, we attempt to really think through the dynamic politics of proletarian struggle in the midst of disaster, assessing how the conditions not of our choosing, so to speak, are still dynamic and quite terrible, and what that means for the kinds of organizing strategies and the spaces where organizing might occur are shifting now and in the immediate future of ecological crisis. And so this includes the absolute necessity of radical analysis of and participation in border struggles, mutual aid networks, popular movements, imagining feminist and queer futurities, questions concerning technology and innovation, and disaster communism. And one of the things I'm going to talk about today is really circulation struggles and how we're thinking about the politics of blockades, social reproduction, and labor. And really, I don't want to come off as necessarily the pessimist, but I'm going to offer some, I guess, kind of critical assessments of labor in one sort of case study, which is around pipeline politics in the Dakotas, especially concerning Keystone XL, but also touching on some of the new struggles that Peter brought up as well. So in the last 10 years, while there have been advances made in rhetoric and strategy amongst climate mass movements, the last decade hasn't really seen any kind of substantive climate action on this continent, with perhaps the sole exception of the defeat of the Keystone XL pipeline. This defeat and the politics surrounding it, which came to also include the blockade at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation of the Dakota Access Pipeline, I feel is overwhelmingly positive, and is one of the things that I've been most substantively involved in over this last period of time. Though the Obama administration initially made this decision and Biden upheld it early in this year, these decisions were made only after sustained pressure led by indigenous nations, especially the Oceti, Choctaw, and Oyate, and their allies. And in many accounts, there's a pretty clear divide made between the Oyate and the oil infrastructure corporations and their corrupt politicians, lobbyists, media empires, and so on. And so today I want to ask, in this sort of Manichean division that can sometimes be made between us and them, what are we to make of the fact that industrial labor has been almost ubiquitously wrong-headed on the question of oil pipelines? And in fact, the rise to prominence of oil pipelines has shifted more labor unions away from coalitions with green groups than earlier in this decade. Despite all of our analytical discussions of why labor and climate struggles ought to be aligned, on this most clear, easy, and morally just side of struggle, organized labor and significant fractions of the working class sided with capital. And not just capital, but really the most despicable elements of capital, the Koch brothers, anti-union groups, essentially. Is this the last gasp of jobs versus the environment, or is it a harbinger of future realignments that the proletariat will face in the coming decades? What does this mean strategically for anti-capitalist organizing in the climate crisis? Does it cast doubt on some of the more optimistic theses of labor and environmental solidarity? And what does it tell us about the dynamic character and class composition of the proletariat and the struggles it engages right now? These are some of the questions that I'm curious about, and I'm not going to say that I'm going to answer them, but put them on the table. So what I'm going to do in the remaining, probably, I don't even know, 10, 15 minutes I have left, is start by placing this context in the context of two theoretical lines that are popular among the left, broadly construed right now, in assessing questions of labor and climate. And then I'm going to briefly spend some time discussing what I'm describing here as organized labor's contemptible role in pipeline struggles, touching also on the labor conditions that pipeline workers face and why they might be attached to this form of resource extraction and the affordances that it gives them in the region. And finally, I'm just going to briefly gesture towards making the case that the blockade at Standing Rock was not just an indigenous struggle and not just an indigenous proletarian struggle, but a struggle of the proletarian class more generally, and give some provisional notes maybe on what the characteristic of that class composition might be, and what it might mean for labor climate politics. I'm not sure how much of that I'll actually get to, but okay, so the Keystone XL rejection takes place in the context of two important advancements in left ecological thought and practice. One that might be more general and one that's more specific. The first is a renewed focus on the necessity of working class labor agitation to a just transition to a more climate amenable world. And the second is a thesis concerning the primacy of circulation struggles in our contemporary moment, including around ports, logistics, maritime canals, choke points, and energy trade. So I'm going to briefly describe each of these in turn. So the first assumption that a lot of, and I'm using the left here to include everything from not so much liberals, but certainly social democrats, all the way through to left communists and the like. And some of these assumptions might be shared or not shared among this. But in any case, I think that there's a broad sort of consensus right now that working class agitation of some form or another is crucial to producing the conditions and accelerating the conditions of anti-capitalist struggle that is necessary to adequately confront the climate crisis. And this thesis is supported and argued in a number of different ways. We can see it in the rise of the Blue-Green Alliance and the popularity of just transition language, which really comes out of the organized labor movements in the 90s. More recently, the alliance between worker-focused and eco-socialist elements of the Democratic Socialists of America in supporting the passage of the PRO Act. We can see it in rising desires by much of the workforce to be in a union, despite very historically low union participation rates. And perhaps there is some evidence of increasing union-sanctioned and extra-union actions, including strikes, work stoppages, and the like around the world. There are also increasing adoption of worker organizing and labor organizing strategies by aspects of the climate movement. These include climate strikes, led mostly by young people, as well as the use of things like structured tests and other sorts of labor organizing strategies popularized by Jane McAlevey in groups like the Sunrise Movement. And finally, I think we can see such a consensus emerge in theorizations of social reproduction by Marxist feminists, and as an analytic for understanding environmental justice struggles and the broader struggles over life and habitability led by proletarians, as more than a supplementary politics to the sort of worker struggles that occur in traditionally imagined workplaces, however those might be conceived. So that's sort of a zone of potential consensus number one. The second development that's maybe a little bit more specific concerns the primacy of circulation struggles. And the version I'm really most interested in here that's become almost I mean, it's become almost a refrain on the left, is this sort of simplistic story that is advanced most clearly by Timothy Mitchell, and most recently rehabilitated in this Adam Curtis documentary, that coal workers in Appalachia in the early 20th centuries had gained and exercised power because they could interrupt streams and flows of coal. Well, by contrast, oil, and in particular pipelines, were invented and sort of began to become ubiquitous because labor did not have the same sort of relationship of interruption to them. And thus, historically, when we look back at interruptions of pipelines from the early 20th century that Mitchell looks at, they're most likely not by workers per se, but by, say, national liberation movements and the like. And here we can look at, for example, something like Andreas Malm's essay called "The Walls of the Tank," which examines the Palestinian general strike of 36 to 39, and the centrality of interrupting the Mosul-Haifa pipeline to that particular struggle, just to connect to, again, some of contemporary events. So the idea in this when this thesis is taken from that historic moment into the present, is that if we interrupt flows of energy, we'll be able to gain more power. Now, so we can contest maybe some aspects of these theses. Really, I'd like those to serve as background for thinking about where labor actually lies right now. So there was really an extended break between organized labor and environmental groups over the Keystone Pipeline, one that stretches all the way back to 2013 and 2012, when the Keystone Pipeline sort of rose to prominence. The first split was really spearheaded by the Laborers International, and sort of as well as buttressed by comments made by Richard Trumka, AFL-CIO. Laborers International President Terry Sullivan said at that time that the divide between labor and the environment on pipelines was deep and wide as the Grand Canyon. We're repulsed by some of our supposed brothers and sisters lining up with these job killers to destroy the lives of working men and women. And so laborers who had previously been in alliance in the Blue-Green Alliance, a sort of a group advocating for green infrastructure and the like, shifted and joined AFL-CIO, the traditionally conservative building and construction trades unions, in opposing, in supporting Keystone XL. This realignment continued through the Trump administration, and you might be surprised, also continued into criticism of Biden's upholding of Obama's decision to stop the pipeline. So in January 2021, we have a reiteration, really an outpouring of criticism of Biden administration in rejecting the pipeline. These included statements from, again, Laborers International, AFL-CIO, Buildings Trades, Plumbers and Pipe Fitters, and United Steelworkers, and also included some surprising about faces. And the Teamsters are sort of interesting in this regard. So HAFA initially, for example, was pro-oil, and the Teamsters were very much open to Arctic drilling up until around 2008, when he made a real about face. In 2008, HAFA said, global warming is for real, air pollution is killing people and making our children sick. And you know what? We share some of that blame. In the past, we were forced to make a false choice. The choice was good jobs or a clean environment. If we wanted clean air, the economy would suffer and jobs would be sent overseas. Well, guess what? We let the big corporations pollute and the jobs went overseas anyway. We didn't enforce environmental regulations and the economy still went in the toilet. The middle class got decimated and the environment is on the brink of disaster. Well, I say enough is enough. No more false divides. The future, if we are to prosper as a nation, will lie in a green economy. A decade later, Hoffa described the Teamsters' support of the Keystone Pipeline, simply saying it will America needs access to various forms of energy that will keep its economy running in the years ahead. This decision will hurt that effort. Now, union is not, organized labor is not in consensus in support of the pipeline. There are, of course, National Nurses United, National Domestic Workers Alliance, a few SEIU chapters among the unions who are opposed to the pipeline. We can make the common criticisms of organized labor. These are just the leaders of these unions. Perhaps worker power is organized on the shop floor and in the rank and file rather than by these particular voices. And it wouldn't upset me so much, except these are only statements. What do they actually indicate? Several of these unions also backed up their statements with money and with capital by devoting themselves and really partnering with oil capital to seed the sort of disinformation, denial, outright lies in assessments around who was opposing the pipeline, who's on the ground at Standing Rock, suggesting that these were not working class people, that it was all indigenous folks who are being taken advantage of by Californian hippies and rich people seeking a sort of sob story for the new millennium. The groups that they partnered with, the sort of Koch wing of fossil capital included the Midwest Alliance for Infrastructure Now, which funneled this money into promoting tweets on social media, sowing disinformation, getting op-eds in regional newspapers, and gaming Google's search system. So if you search for, say, pipelines, you would come up against an industry fact-checking website and the like. On top of this, anecdotally, union members in the region, in the upper Midwest, were among those also most incensed by pipeline opposition. And I think pipeline opponents sometimes frame these workers as astroturfed, as if they're just paid off by capital to bust them into public meetings and the like. But such an argument ignores the work conditions and interests at stake in these projects, which are, a quick look at the work conditions actually shows that they're even more damning for advocates of a just transition thesis. Pipeline workers primarily like their jobs because they pay far better than comparable construction jobs in other sectors, including renewable energy, because they're temporary, because the goal is to get to the pipeline in the ground as quickly as possible. And this goes against one of the main theses of many Green New Deal advocates, that that our argument for a just transition is that we will live in a world that requires less work. The assumption being that people don't want to work as much. But pipeline workers prefer their construction jobs because they're usually organized in 6/10s. So 10-hour days, 6 days a week, meaning they get 20 hours of overtime pay a week. They're compelled and desire to work more, not less. And similar jobs in renewable energy, in wind power, for example, do not offer these same sorts of benefits. In a capitalist system, green energy must be cheaper than fossil fuels if it will be adopted, which means cuts either to the cost of materials and thus labor internationally or labor locally. And wind power is not a highly unionized sector, and most of its jobs are even more temporary than that of oil. So all this could be taken as an indication that the workers versus the environment thesis is not so easily evaded as we think, even for theorists of social reproduction. And to me, it also indicates a somewhat parochial understanding of what kinds of labor we're talking about in climate politics, where that labor is spatially located, and whether any kind of labor-based politics can be prioritized in these spaces. In circulation struggles and in analyses of contemporary unionism alike, where the examples that are upheld are oftentimes, for example, the West Coast Longshoremen's Union, which is a long way away from the Dakotas. Similarly, with as much as it's important to have these struggles in grad student unions, in academia, in nonprofits and the like, those are, far from the sorts of fossil fuel infrastructure that must be shut down. And the gap between them makes labor solidarity really, really difficult. And so just to leave us on a slightly more optimistic note, I think that if we go back to a sort of class composition analysis of who is actually on the blockades in the Dakotas, and now Line 3 in Minnesota, in Anishinaabe territory, and Line 5, Potawatomi, Minnesota, and Michigan, respectively, there are, of course, indigenous proletariats at the head and leading these struggles. But they're joined in an alliance not so much with your traditional environmental and green groups who have been rendered quite unhappily to them only adjacent to these struggles. Instead, it's a new kind of proletariat in this country that is certainly visible in that the pandemic makes more visible, but it's working class youth from around the country, sometimes university educated, but not often, sometimes indigenous and disproportionately women, but not always, and largely available because their flexible service work jobs allow them to dip in and out of the workforce, to travel to blockades and protests and the like. There are also regional histories in each of these places that folks are connecting to, along with various different other elements. And so I guess this leaves me with a real question for how we think about proletariat struggle in the climate crisis. Is our focus on the workplace misguided, or is it that we're looking at the wrong workplace, or we're conceiving of the workplace in a overly narrow way? Are social reproduction struggles like this that go outside of the workplace and connect to longstanding feminist and women of color struggles, in fact, in some ways pushing against the sort of norms of industrial labor organization, or are there ways that they might connect in an immediate way? Because we are, this is, the matter of urgency is particularly important here. And what does it mean? How does this connect to the most difficult question of all, which is the centrality of the proletariat to a struggle that requires its own self-abolition? How do we not render our understanding of worker self-interest into that which is going to carry on perpetually, but something that must also involve the transformation out of a class society and into a classless one? So yeah, I'll end it there, and excited to hear what other folks have to say.
That was wonderful, Guy. Thank you so much. Really appreciate some of the depth that you got into on these questions. I've personally been troubled by so much of the left discourse around an ecological or, Green New Deal or various other formulations seems to just continue to impose work and more work, both in the unwaged realm and, of course, in the wage realm. And as someone who works within organized labor myself, the continued blindness to industries that need to be abolished entirely, right? Yes, we can fight for 15, we can fight for a union at fast food joints, but should such joints ecologically, socially, in any sustainable and sensible society exist, right? So how do you abolish a form of work and an industry which is organized, right, in order to continue to, quote unquote, build a dignity around that job? And these are certainly open and complex questions. So we thank you for how far you've dug into those. Next up, we're going to turn to Caitlin and Johnny from the CounterPower Collective. They're going to be speaking about their book, Organizing for Autonomy, History, Theory, and Strategy for Collective Liberation. And I gather they're going to popcorn back and forth and have a bit of a conversation among themselves as well as with us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. So good afternoon, everyone. And today, Johnny and I are going to bounce back and forth to share some thoughts on the present moment and how we see and hope the work of CounterPower can be a part of moving us into the future. So I'm going to start off by talking about how the roots of the COVID-19 pandemic are in big agriculture, agribusiness, and how the pandemic really necessitates linking environmental questions with global resistance movements and on-the-ground organizing. In other words, the pandemic really sheds light on both ecological and social crisis. So as Rob Wallace and others, though, also have written, global agriculture is to blame. And it was global capital that has driven the deforestation and development that has exposed us to new pathogens. And this relates also to what others have written about in terms of how factory farming is likely at least partially to blame for COVID-19, and certainly is causing the introduction of various novel viruses. So factory farming goes hand in hand with monoculture, so breeding animals that are near genetic clones of each other to produce the perfect meat, right, which wipes out all genetic resistance and then allows a virus to spread rapidly through a flock or herd, and then also mutate and jump species. And this factory farming also requires the monoculture cultivation of grain crops, also with little to no genetic diversity, which in turn links also to more deforestation that's necessary to grow these crops, right? And the point I really want to highlight is this. Capitalism has driven monoculture agriculture and factory farming, which is linked to disease pandemics, but it's also ethically and morally problematic in the ways in which both animals and humans are treated. And so we can see big agribusiness as being to blame for both the exploitation of human labor, which is nearly always precarious labor, often undocumented immigrant labor, as well as displacing indigenous and traditional populations off of their land through land grabbing processes that are necessary to grow these monoculture crops, as we also see in Brazil. So in my own work with right to water movements, or what I would say counter-hegemonic movements fighting to reclaim the commons of water, both in the US and in Brazil and really around the world, I've had the opportunity to learn from anti-capitalist peasant movement struggles, specifically in Brazil, that center this idea of agroecology and food sovereignty. And so that is that this resistance is led by people fighting for and occupying land on which to live and grow food for their families and communities, with practices that are much more in equilibrium with the limits of nature, and don't rely on these big agro-business practices that serve really only to benefit, the so-called top 1%, a few corporations and their subsidiaries who control every level of this large-scale agriculture the world over. And one of the things that people in Brazil talk about a lot and have shared with me repeatedly is how Brazil is still on the periphery of capitalism, with borders created for imperialism. At the same time, there are also Brazilian-owned corporations with shareholders from all over the world, including the US, who are extracting resources for the betterment of a few. And I think this attention to how imperialism exists and continues today is critical. And I think that this analysis is centered in the movements with whom I work in Brazil, because imperialism is more visible there than here, for example, because people are in general more impacted materially day to day. These extractive realities are more visible, right? And today it is the corporation that serves as the primary instrument of imperial extraction. And I want to clarify here what I mean by this is that there is still a metropole. It's just no longer one nation state. It's multiple nation states, even as the US remains a failing hegemon, right? And I think that CounterPower's definition of imperialism, which is actually in our recent book published by Common Notions, Organizing for Autonomy, History, Theory, and Strategy, Collective Liberation, I think we have a really great definition. I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically the idea that imperialism is a total system. It's not merely something between countries. And so this is then relates to how we can think about Brazil is still a periphery country, but there's also dynamics of the core and periphery within that country, where the vast majority of the population exist, right? Especially thinking about landless workers. And so they feel this extractive squeeze more. And I think that this connects to why the landless workers movement, as one example in Brazil, has millions of affiliated people in its struggle, right? Whereas here in the US, we don't have something comparable in terms of scale. So again, we're short on time here. I'm going to return to this, but this also has repercussions for how we think about ecology and ecological rift, even ecofascism and how that relates to this imperialist world system. And I'm going to turn it over to Johnny to relate some of what I've said to on-the-ground struggles, and I apologize for my dog barking in the background.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. I have my dog in the cage, so hopefully he doesn't, but it's open and spacious. So again, Johnny, CounterPower. I'm currently an unemployed restaurant worker since because of the pandemic. I've been a restaurant worker for 20 years, and I'll be actually talking about some of that later, but I think it's to note this pandemic directly affected my own personal life. But speaking of pandemics, like Caitlin just talked about kind of the root causes. But you listen to the news, even a lot of left analysis, very few people even talking about what the root causes of the pandemics are. So that means we're most likely not going to address them, and most likely we're going to have more. It's not whether if we are going to have them, but when and what's kind of the impact of them. So I wanted to talk about how, and this kind of goes into what some other speakers were talking about, how is like the left, as the revolutionary left, the militant organizers, how do we orient ourselves towards our work with all this in mind. And I think one of the best examples currently going on are some comrades down at Cooperation Jackson, Mississippi. Great organization. Check them out. A lot I could say about them. But one of their main things they're doing is building kind of a network of co-ops to be able to build power amongst the working class, but particularly in the historic Black nation in the South. And they have their relief and emergency preparedness effort. And they've kind of pointed out that since Hurricane Katrina and that catastrophe, we've noticed that the government really, federal government in particular, doesn't care about Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and working class communities when it comes to these disasters. And they're not going to act. Same thing happened with COVID-19. How long did we have to wait for PPE? How long did we have to wait for relief, etc.? So they identify two tasks that we need to have this in mind. One is building self-governing institutions with the skills and capacity to be able to overcome the mounting crisis now, and the ones in the future, and also build movements that have enough power to be able to transform society. In our own language, we'd kind of call these organs of autonomy, within also organs of counterpower. And in Cooperation Jackson, they have two that I think are important to note. One is their farm co-ops, so they're able to actually provide food to some people in West Jackson, though not enough, which also pointed out because their capacity is not built up that yet. But one I found really interesting, which was their community production co-op, which was their latest one that's come to play, where they were able to produce masks, PPE, personal protection equipment, with a 3D printer and also hand sewn masks. So now, yes, co-ops. People talk about co-ops on the left. They love co-ops. There's also like co-ops in that they're just kind of avoiding the problem. It's just kind of doing alternative institutions for the sake of a good example. But I think what Cooperation Jackson has shown that co-ops and building and other ways of building capacity amongst communities is a way that can actively serve and help to assist our current struggles. So they, colleague Kuno from Cooperation Jackson noted that comrades in Milan and Naples, where COVID kind of hit strong in Europe, said, don't even think about mutual aid unless you have proper protection first. So they started producing these masks. So you can see how they can go hand in hand to be able to give us that capacity to act. It's not just simply about providing an example. It kind of goes hand in hand into one movement. So now the pivot a little bit, because also we're trying to slow our time here, is I want to look at like some of the industries affected by the shutdowns that happened. And one in particular is my industry, the restaurant industry. So when we think of ecological struggles, we don't necessarily think of retail and restaurants. Retail and restaurants are the two largest private sector employers in the nation. Restaurants alone have over 10 million workers. And what kind of work is that? Low wage, and work with no benefits. 6 out of the 10 lowest paid jobs in the United States are in the food service industry. 7 out of the lowest 10, if you include cashiers, which straddle both food service and retail. The demographics of the sector, like kind of what Kai was talking about, are mostly Black, Latinx, Indigenous, youth, heavily women, large sections of sexual divisional labor, of gender divisional labor, so et cetera, et cetera. So this, not just based on the industry they are, because the tertiary industry in a certain sense, capitalism can exist without restaurants. It can exist without food production. So there's a fine line that it straddles there. But these are where our jobs are. These are where the fighting, the abilities to fight against capital are as well. So I would just kind of throw out there that, like, now with this kind of so-called labor shortage of people deciding, and this kind of goes to what Eleanor was talking about as well, is like, I'm worth more than $12 an hour. I'm worth more than $10 an hour, or the tip minimum wage in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm is $3.89. It's $2.13 in other places. So this labor shortage, but we're really seeing is a shortage of people willing to work for undignified work, or the work for low wages. So I just want to put out there that when we talk about these ecological struggles, it's not just simply frontline medical workers, or even people in like fossil fuel industry and such. Like, what effect on the economy is it going to have, and what's going to be shut down, and where those workers are, and how are we going to orient towards them to be able to organize down the line. So I'll end there, and then I think we're going to go back and forth.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll just try to back up on it, and then hand it back over to Johnny. So I think, and I actually think what I'm about to say also relates to what Kai was talking about, but what I have observed in kind of popular struggles in Brazil is that there is more of a base that we don't have in the same way here in the United States. And I think that one of the reasons for this is that there is more understanding, and I'm going to make a generalization here, but there is more understanding in Latin America in general, and I think Brazil specifically, of how to build a multi-sector struggle, right? So people are organizing for autonomy, but then coming together across those different struggles. So for example, you see this in terms of resistance against land grabbing, or the landless workers movement for taking and reclaiming land, or in anti-privatization struggles fighting against privatization of water, for example, that brings different sectors together. So thinking about water organizing against water grabbing. So when I say water grabbing, I mean could be a bottled water company wanting to take water out of the ground and commodify it and make a profit off of it, or large hydro dam projects. And there's various other forms as well. Financialization of water right now, trading water as a commodity on Wall Street, which also relates to big agriculture because you need water to farm, right? So these struggles for land and water go hand in hand. A dam project that displaces small farmers, often indigenous and traditional communities, from their land, so that big agro can use it, or big mining that requires dams. So like most of the dams aren't actually for hydropower, they're providing energy for the people. They're to further the interest of corporations. And so what movements such as, I noted already, the Landless Workers Movement, or MST, or MABI, Movimento dos Atingidos por Barragens, which is movement of people affected by dams, which fights for those impacted by dams. They are able to create these cross-sector alliances with unions, various different trade unions, education unions, other popular social movements like Levante Juventude, the youth movement, or small farmers movement, and others across Latin America, and indeed transnational alliances even in the world, to really build this struggle for autonomy, to reclaim land and fight for power control of resources. And these are connected to then this larger movement that is seen as a workers' struggle, workers in various forms, but a workers' struggle. So defined in much broader terms than what I think typically we see here. And also, especially nowadays, creating more linkages to thinking about that in terms of environmental struggle as well. And all of this ultimately goes back to base building, which these popular movements are so intentional about. And I lack time to go into the details here, but I'm going to turn it back over to Johnny.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, so what you all just said, like internationally, that also was making me think about some of the questions that Kai was bringing up about like what the role of labor in all of this and why some of these unions have really kind of failed us. And I think that goes to what I've been talking about with the restaurant sector and how it's always like where like it's a microcosm of the neo-colonial, settler colonial composition of the United States. If you look at the division of labors, of the demographics, but like I said, and I want to clarify before, like capitalism can exist without restaurants, but it can't exist without food production. I don't say can't exist. But so I think that one of the answers might be what's the composition of the workforce and who's doing it on those pipelines and such. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I know in the food chain, if we go beyond restaurants, and this is where I think, not saying the primacy of restaurant workers struggle, but just a way to broaden our horizons and our thinking about what is our ecological struggles, is if you look at the food chain, also some of the lowest paid jobs and also menial labor done by mostly immigrants and Black workers. Food, I think we all know the stories of like people were afraid where they were going to get their chicken and their pork at the beginning of the pandemic because the workers were having mass breakouts and such. So I think that's something to think about. So, but when we're talking about what's the point of even talking about like these things, because we want to change them and we want to have strategies to be able to change them. And one of the things that we kind of bring to as CounterPower, bring through in the book, is in order to build these organs of autonomy and these organs of counterpower with the purpose of building what we call a system of counterpower that is able to become counter-hegemonic, battle the system and form a new system based on councils, communes, and commons, is you need revolutionary organization. And we are a organization of militants that do work in various sectors. And through the organization, I know just in my own work, I've really benefited from the multi-sectoral nature of our organization and the work that we do, where we can have these discussions to summarize our experiences and to really impact the work that we do. And to even, so if we are to be able to take on this system, we need to be able to capture these moments. So like Eleanor was talking about, of people rethinking things and coming together horizontally, coming together in the moment in this wave of struggle, and be able to capture them so that it doesn't just have to die until the next wave of struggle, that we can continue through that wave of struggle. And as these waves of struggle continue, we capture more and more in that, and we're able to organize ourselves horizontally, organize ourselves in a self-determined way, and insert ourselves into struggle so that we're more prepared for the next wave of struggle. And like, I'll kind of end with, we kind of see this as like there's 4 key things we need to do. We got to build those organizations, those organs of autonomy that I mentioned, people self-defense. You know, we're just looking at all these communities that are coming under attack. Parties of autonomy. So not just these dictatorial, like rigid left parties sometimes who are trying to control movements, but parties of organizers who are meant to foster movements, who want to be one in the same kind of dialectical relationship to them, and also building united fronts across sectors. And I think that we can have all these analyses, but unless we start getting organized and put them together, then they're not going to be as powerful. So yeah, I'm looking forward to some discussion and questions. So on that.
Thank you, Johnny and Caitlin. And I just want to comment that really your reflections here today deepen our understanding of these prompts and these questions and this conversation by going internationally, right? digging deeply into your own personal experiences, as Johnny did in reflecting on these contemporary crises. Of course, expanding our notions, not just in Brazil, but where I live in the Northwest, the struggle over water, right? The very means of survival is something that's been very, very key to the Keystone Pipeline struggles, to Brazilian struggles, and of course with Nestle always trying to get a hold of our freshwater reserves here in Oregon, something that we've dealt with most recently. So there's a number of questions that have been coming in. Malav, do you mind turning us toward the full discussion period? I'm seeing Peter and seeing Eleanor. Great, wonderful. And Kai too. Great. So I kind of want to begin where Eleanor took us and where Johnny kind of concluded us. And that's in trying to revisit some of these questions of identity post-pandemic. And the reason I raise this question is there's been a lot of ink spilled in the last few weeks in regards to service workers, essential workers, fast food workers refusing to return to work. And I think there's a real difference there in how that's been approached, say by the Wobblies or the SEIU fast food campaigns, right? The Wobblies instinctively understood, because they paid attention to working class self-activity and the desires of the members, that they were not fighting for dignity, respect, and good wages on these jobs. They were fighting for these jobs not to exist, and were utilizing that as just a temporary relief in order to go on and do other things about their lives, right? The more traditional unions have been organizing in regards to some real limited and problematic scopes, where the belief that this will just simply replace the UAW or other more traditional industrial unions by focusing on another sector. And that's not really addressed the problem either, right? So where I want to go with this, and I'm wondering the reflections from you all, is how do we start thinking about these changes of identity, not just personally, but as part of a larger collective project? And the reasoning for that is we're seeing that already taking place on this individual level in regards to the service industry and fast food. How do we organize around that? How do we collectivize around that? Not just in regards to worker struggle themselves, but it goes without saying the massive amount of food waste that takes place in the service economy. Not to mention anything in regards to large agriculture and big ag and its effects on the fast food industry, right? These struggles are clearly intertwined. So to rephrase that, how do we start talking about these individual choices that many of you spoke to in more collective terms? And maybe we could start with Eleanor, since you really brought us to this question.
Yeah, I would be happy to address this, and this also sort of touches on areas where I have done more sort of developed, more expertise or have more developed thoughts. So in my estimation, one of the most important things that we can do as revolutionaries, as radical leftists, and also as people who are wanting to cultivate a popular radical left revolutionary movement, right? Like, we're not looking to create a cadre that seizes the power of the state from within or from some sort of resurrection, right? Like, we're all sort of in agreement that this needs to be a genuinely popular movement, and that it needs to it needs to bring in people who we're not used to talking to, or we're not used to attracting through the channels that we attract leftists, universities, youth movements, counterculture. And in my estimations, one of the areas where I've seen that done is through community-based struggle, and that meaning struggles that are rooted in place. I think Cooperation Jackson is a really excellent example of this. Rooted in place, but in a particular understanding of place, and in recapturing histories of resistance in a place, recapturing the cultural, the sort of the real authentic culture of places. I mean, and not sugarcoating social dislocations, not sugarcoating hierarchies that exist, but bringing them into our politics, and developing an understanding of place. By place, I mean cities, towns, neighborhoods, and where people are organizing as neighbors, as neighborhoods, as neighbors, or for example, as tenants. I think you really see this in tenant union organizing that's been taking off recently. And obviously the necessity is a major part of that, right? People need to stay in their homes. And at the same time, that where that's being done really successfully is it's being tied to longer histories of resistance in a place. And I think that in social movements that I've really seen across the world, they're always most successful when there is that sense of pride about where you're from and being from that place, and coming together and embracing the diversity of where you're from, and also seeing that place through the prism of histories of resistance. And as I mentioned, I'm sort of visiting the U.S. I'm back with my family in the suburbs, and having been away for a couple of years, and now coming back to the thick of I'm in like the Washington D.C. suburbs, coming back to the thick of the Washington D.C. suburbs, and just seeing how the alienation is more profound than ever. And people don't have a sense of place, and where struggles have been strongest have been in cities like Portland, where entire cities are coming up and uprising against, for example, against the police when they were kidnapping protesters off the street. That galvanized some of the most important anti-racist alliance work in Portland. So I'll sort of leave it there and let someone else continue to develop that thought.
I think I'm going to prompt Peter here and then throw it back to the rest of the panel. I think where Eleanor was going there, at least in the reflections that I had on their comments at that particular moment, was some of these like large, deep cultural practices that take those individual identities and collectivize them, right, and allow us to revisit them in larger historical practices. So I was hoping you'd speak a little bit more about your work on May Day and your historical work on how various proletariats, to use Kai's earlier comment, kind of recompose themselves around these ideas, identities, and challenges. And which ones are coming to you at this particular moment that are important for ecological and workers' struggles?
Yeah. Oh dear, can you hear me? I'm using these for the first time, and I can't really hear myself very well. But
we hear you.
So who cares? Anyway, thanks everybody for this information about unions and workers and struggle and ecology. I'm Eleanor, if you asked me what identity I was, I share yours. I'm a revolutionary as well. But what that means, what that identity means, is in progress. It's not fixed. And when Kevin asked us how you're thinking about ecological and workers' struggle instead of what are you thinking, I think with books. And so I'm really happy to learn about 3 new books from today. And the book that I will read again this afternoon, I'm in the Eastern time zone, but I'm tiring, and I'm looking forward to a nap. But I want to study Common Sense, the book that Tom Paine wrote in February 1776, proposing that somebody declare independence. And when he said common sense, I was hoping he would be talking about Jackson, Mississippi, so to speak, about co-ops, about communes, about household commons. But he wasn't. He was talking about and engaged in a philosophical quarrel with the bourgeois concept of common sense as a way of escaping radical empiricism. I think I need to know this philosophy better to understand what he meant by commons and why that critique of philosophy and of government and society was a revolutionary matter. Like the money that he got from that was given for mittens for armed people. And I also want to say to all of you bookmakers that John Milton said that our books are those fabulous dragon's teeth, and being sewn up and down may chance to spring up as armed people. And I wish that upon your books. The book that Kevin referred to and that I wrote is called Red Round Globe Hot Burning, which tries to understand the privatization of the world and into private property and slavery in the period at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and to tell this as a love story between an African-American woman and an Irishman, an Irish renegade from the British Empire. But one of the things I got out of doing that work was to see the richness of the commons and of forms of commoning that privatization had to destroy. And we need to know this history in our different neighborhoods as part of your municipalism. We need to know it in terms of the forms of agrarian life and of the woods and grains that we're going to make and our future. But I think we all know that already. For me, what I got out of that book, Red Round Globe Hot Burning, is not a book, but it's some real history that belongs to all of us. And that is that there were two shells that were created to hold the power for this privatization. And one of those was they were United States and United Kingdoms. The UK and the USA are two very temporary political forms, and we need now to rethink them, which is why I spoke of Turtle Island to begin with, and why some people now speak of being from Georgia or Michigan and to develop a state identity. We are trying to form a new kind of identity. And I'm especially grateful to Kai for telling me more about the pipeline struggle and the new identities and new combinations of people that are being formed in that struggle. Anyway, so I'm thinking about revolution and what it's going to mean, what it means for us, not as a matter of fire and brimstone. I mean, we don't need to worry about that. That comes upon us without trying. But what we're going to do otherwise, especially with our reproduction work, reproduce ourselves because we live in a system of death. And to Johnny in the restaurant sector, I was thinking that this is related, isn't it, to the refusal of housework? That the growth of the restaurant industry has to do with the refusal of cooking at home. Anyway, thanks a lot. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Peter. And as we're thinking about this richness of commons and various forms of life, I want to throw it to our other panelists for their thoughts and reflections.
I was just going to quickly say something in response to your original question, but that I'll also speaks to what Eleanor and Peter said. I mean, I think that like one of the things that we're seeing crumble in the last 10, 20 years is the idea of environmentalism and environmentalist as like a distinct special interest group. And I think that's a good thing, because the primary thesis that we need to have is that like all revolutionaries should have an ecological component to their struggles, and everyone with an ecological like sensibility should be a revolutionary. You know, not these sort of traditional U.S. forms of environmentalism, which tend to be elitist, exclusionary, have roots in like, you know, historic white supremacy and the like. And that we need that, not just because of who the identity of the proletariat is, but also because it's got to be global for the reasons that Caitlin and Yanni and Johnny sort of outlined, right? On the other hand, I do think that I might say that there are multiple different kinds of place-based identities, and some of them I'm all for, and some of them I'm skeptical of. And one thing that we didn't talk about, but that Out of the Woods talks a lot about, is there will be, and there already is, a prevalence of an increase of migration globally around the world due to the impacts of the climate crisis and the ways in which those impacts are funneled through the class societies that exist globally. And I think that another, among the many things that we've yet to like really crack is to figure out how to link up some of the pro-migrant and anti-border struggles with place-based ecological and indigenous movements. And those alliances are, no alliance is automatic. Alliances have to be forged and built. And that's one of the takeaways from looking at the history of workers and environmental and ecological politics, which have oftentimes passed like two ships in the night. So I wonder, I guess that's why I want to say that like if there is a name to the identity of struggles, whether it's revolutionary, proletariat, working class, or whatnot, it has to have a kind of general portability, and yet specific enough to inscribe its anti-capitalism in its subjects in a certain way, and make them enroll us in that kind of project, which is really, really hard. Out of the Woods has struggled around this question. Other thinkers, it's the last page of every climate book. It's like, who's going to be the subject that does this? I don't know. I know that in the CounterPower book, which is really great, you all talk about the people as a subject, and power to the people as one framework that can be thought of, while recognizing that there are historic issues with that as well. I don't know, and it's the people and the movements, the collectives that are actually doing this on the ground that will come up with that name. But I'm, for one, am not mourning the end of environmentalist as a special interest subject group.
Can I respond? Okay. So yeah, I think there's so much stuff to go off of here, but just to start with going off of what Eleanor's point about kind of these community struggles. And I mean, I'm just thinking like, yes, right? yes. And I think one of the differences, as I think about organizing in the US specifically in relation to, say, Brazil, though, is that a lot of even like movement work has been in recent years very much led by nonprofits, right? And kind of the nonprofit industrial complex. And I'm thinking about even fights to reclaim water or fight against water privatization, that often it is in a nonprofit structure leading that. And I think that in many ways, this is an obstacle to kind of, in many ways, creating that community-led grassroots connection that creates a multi-sector struggle that's also politicized. At the same time, though, I think that some of these movements, and certainly I've seen in the work I've been engaged in here in Pittsburgh, does have counter-hegemonic tendencies. And I think that, I'm thinking about how this could relate to Peter's point, really, about fighting against privatization and for the idea, just even thinking of water, but we could fill it in with something else, right, as more of a comment. And I think, Peter, the point you made about you said the US and UK are private shells created to hold privatization, but they're temporary political forms, and we need to rethink them. And that really resonated for me, because then I was like, oh, what Kai said, your point about even immigration and immigrant struggles. So I'm thinking, like, when we think about borders, they are a part of this creation and violence of the nation state, right? And enclosing and privatizing the commons that has created this, to quote Peter again, but this system of death. And so I guess what I'm hoping, or I'm thinking about, is that an organization like CounterPower is a way to give some structure to help facilitate and coordinate making these linkages and doing this base building. And yeah, I guess, that's my hope.
If I may, on the next one. Yeah, and kind of, thanks for all your thoughts. I'm trying to see the limited amount of time left to address. So maybe like the original question of like how to collectivize this identity. Said it before, I said it again, through organization, I think, is the way you do it. And I think there's always been this tension that is kind of going away between like, individual and organization, or does an organization have to be hierarchical, non-hierarchical? I'm really excited to read a new book coming out by Rodrigo Nunes, which is about like the against centralism and decentralism in an organization, like it's kind of false dichotomy. And we kind of think about that in CounterPower. And so when I say collectivized organization, like you, through like mass organizations like tenants unions, you can collectivize the struggles that are going on in your block and kind of learn to process those. And the struggle isn't just the struggle against like the landlord or like the rent increases in the city. The struggles are between the people, the subjects who are taking part there. So there's that idea of like unity, struggle, transformation. That when you enter a struggle and you come out of it, you're not the same person who entered it. And that it's not just like things that get changed as like structures, it's people that get changed during these struggles. And I think that's something we have to think about. But then you have these struggles, and how do you collectivize those struggles? And I think that's through revolutionary organization, and not the idea of the past. We just need the one party. One of the things that we talked about is creating what we call the area of the party. So you have multiple revolutionary organizations that can act. They might not be the same, but they don't have to necessarily compete with each other. But they're kind of stronger than the sum of your parts in the kind of the ecosystem that you create with the revolutionary struggle. So that's one point. Okay, yeah, it's someone brought up food, but I'm not sure we're related to. I thought it was poignant. One example of revolutionaries we really look to is the MIR, the revolutionary left movement in Chile during the kind of 70s and early 80s. And one of the big struggles they had were a series of occupations and such. And they had one where the occupied bakeries, because the bakeries were giving the bad bread and kind of price gouging towards the workers and giving the more airy, lighter bread. So it's more nutritious and better, but also less price to the rich people. And so they took them over and started doing community production of the food. So when thinking about like restaurants, like your point, Kevin, it's like, yeah, we don't need, like I always say, we don't need half the restaurants that, we don't need half. I think restaurants will exist in a new society, but with a different, because the places of community, they're the places of kind of, especially I'm Italian as well. And my family in Italy, like that's all that we do when I go there is just eat massive amount of food. But then you can have a sense of where food came from and kind of and all those things. So, but because of the subjectivity of the work providing that work, they can revolutionize, and we can just, as bakers or as restaurant workers, but it doesn't mean we have to stay kind of back to identity, just as bakers, as restaurant workers. Now we're doing it as part of a larger struggle, a larger community. And the forging of this revolutionary subject, too, like Kai said, is we have these structural points that, the proletariat against capital, women, non-binary against heteropatriarchy. And that there's always crossover, and you don't only have one another. But that doesn't mean that every non-binary person's revolutionary, or every working class person's revolutionary. But that has to be forged out of struggle. So even the subject itself, on an individual level, to be collectivized, has to be forged in a kind of collectivized way. And final point, if you think we're going to have a revolution in the United States and it's going to be within the confines of the 50 states, and that's all those little lines, then that's not going to happen. Like Southwest, it's going to bleed over into Mexico. It's going to bleed over. Certain regions will it's not going to look the same. So I think it's also, we have to get rid of this settler colonial mindset when we kind of in national chauvinism when we're kind of talking about revolution here.
Thank you all. And I think these comments are really well leading into a question that came through our YouTube observers currently. Kai commented, and I think this is important to note again, is that alliances are not natural. There's something that have to be forged. They have to be struggled with. They have to be dealt with, approached, and organized around. And I think from the comments that you all have been making in regards to the circulation of struggles that is currently taking place in the United States and across the planet around mutual aid, against pipelines, Black Lives Matter, and other struggles are certainly important to note. Many of the examples we've talked about today are particular. They are place-based, right? We're talking about Cooperative Jackson. We're talking about particular municipal struggles. Peter dove into some of the deep historical questions and the places of which they took place as well, of course. And the question that's coming in from our observers today is that of scale. How do we scale up, right? How do we go from these little organized individual projects in particular places? How do they link up into other larger struggles, not just in alliances? And I think some of the comments that you all were just making reminds me of the work of Peter Linebaugh and his comrades in the Midnight Notes Collective, is that the refusal, the one no against capitalism, and the many yeses, the forms of organization and life that will emerge in direct rejection of it and in the construction and production of another world. How do we actually do that work and move from small, individual, organized revolutionary projects and collectives up to larger confederations or other ways of organizing our society? So I put to you all that question of scale.
I'll jump in really quick because I think it actually ties one small piece of answering that question, which maybe isn't like the satisfying, all-encompassing answer that folks want to hear, but I think that that you know, when Peter brought up sort of looking at these revolutionary histories in our own country, and the so-called American Revolution is a complex, not clear cut, not a uniformly let's say good movement. There's plenty to criticize, but something that was alive in that movement and that's alive in that document, Common Sense, is this concept of citizenship. And I think we're all like kind of scared of that concept, or we don't like that concept, and that's completely understandable, especially because of what we're going through today. And we think about citizenship tied to the state. And I think, drawing from other social ecologists and also from movements that I've witnessed in various parts of the world, is that we can radicalize this concept of citizenship. There's something, we need to take that concept away from the state. We need to be cultivating new kinds of citizenship. And, we mentioned migrant struggles, and I think that actually is a really powerful way to start really actively making undocumented people and immigrants of all kinds, really bringing them to the center, to say that this is a different kind of citizenship. We're going to just get away, jettison our vassalage to the state and create a new kind of collective identity. And I think that needs to be happening at various levels. And, it's a cheesy concept, right? This idea of like the earth citizen, but it is kind of infinite, right? Like you can see yourself as a citizen of your block, a citizen of your neighborhood, a citizen of your town, a citizen of your state. I mean, I think even at a regional level, that might be that local politics is, probably going to be more important there. But I think citizenship captures some of that kind of universalism that we want. And, maybe that word isn't used in all places at all the time. And I think whatever words are used has to be in conversation with indigenous communities and decolonial movements and non-Western peoples. But that meaning, there's something important there that we need to be touching back to as we struggle, because that's going to help us build out, that's going to help us be recognizable to each other. I'll leave it there.
I just quickly could respond to say, so a term that I've been thinking about a lot recently is this idea of translocality and translocal struggles. And this is in the context of my, trying to write the conclusion of my dissertation. But I think that there is something that could be useful about this idea, because I think what it does, like using the term translocal instead of even thinking about like transnational, right, or global fight or struggle, is that it allows to keep the local and then connect it to the global. So to understand how kind of corporate and economic and still state also structures are operating, or how transnational corporations are seeking to further like privatize what should be the commons. But at the same time, understanding that this doesn't necessarily mean that there's some like global movement or organization that all operates under just one name and all but right, it allows for kind of differences in terms of geographic location and race and gender and sexuality, and all kinds of other like even like place-based differences, while still understanding kind of that everyone's connected in a struggle, and that there are opportunities to connect and learn with each other through various types of forums, right, and communication networks to learn from each other's struggles and help be in solidarity with each other. So I'll just wanted to say that.
I guess a really quick, not more practical, but I would describe my comment as practical how to jump scale. I think one thing that we learned that pipeline organizers and comrades have learned is that, first of all, a pipeline isn't just in one place. It's, the one that we were fighting was 2,200 miles long. So that's a pretty big scale as it is. But the other thing is, of course, capital saturates all aspects of our lives, as do the various kinds of relationships that make up global white supremacy, coloniality, imperialism, and the like. And so it wasn't difficult, once we hit like a scale problem, it wasn't difficult for us to say to other people, you can find a bank that's financing this project near you. You can find a trading center through which commodities, corporations, firms, and the like that are involved in this project are entangled in. Similarly, if we learn from the uprisings this last summer, it wasn't difficult once the tactic began to spread for proletarians to realize that they could find a racist statue in their town, go there, and take it down themselves. And that exercise of power just had to be circulated visibly in our media networks, much as we're visible right now. And there's certainly all kinds of security and infosec things that we need to talk about, but like seeing things happen is involved in that first initial step that gets people to realize that they have power. That it is collective power that we're constantly told we don't have, and that only appears in the institutions that sort of make our lives miserable. But we actually do have that power. And once you start seeing it happen, and more frequently, you want to get involved. You want to do it yourself, do it ourselves. So I guess I punt on the scale question a little bit because certainly there's still how do we federate disagreements and whatnot? These are really important. But at the same time, I think that it's never been easier, and there's never been more fertile ground to share in struggles. And it just has to, we're all sort of in an interregnum moment right now where we're wondering and thinking and being judicious about thinking about what strategies we're going to come up with next. And I think that's really exciting. So.
Eleanor, I know you wanted to jump in with a quick reply to Kai.
Yeah, something that Kai mentioned made me think that just a really important answer to this question, and a quick one, is that I think sometimes this question of scale is a false dilemma that we set up for ourselves, where we go oh my God, this is so daunting. How are we going to grow our movements? And we forget that crises happen, and that in those moments, suddenly there are thousands or millions of people on the street ready to go. And then we're caught on the back foot, unprepared. And that actually, one way we could really be better spending our time is preparing for the next crisis. Kai had mentioned that, struggling against pipelines that are thousands of miles long. And you think about Standing Rock, how that suddenly, came to scale. And it was the challenge of there not being enough in place to retain those people. And we certainly saw that with COVID-19 mutual aid projects. Suddenly, there were literally millions of people around the world participating in these networks. So I think that sometimes it can be a bit of a false dilemma. And instead, what we can think about is how are we bringing people in? What are the access ramps that we're providing for people to continue to be engaged? What kind of, as Johnny said earlier on, what kind of revolutionary organization are we offering for people to be a part of?
Wonderful, Eleanor. We're actually going to transition to one final question. This is coming through both the wires and some of the conversation that we've all been having, and some of my reflections on it. And I think it's important to note here one of our dear comrades, George Kafensis, and his reflection on the work energy crisis and the apocalypse, right? Clearly, we're in the midst of a work and energy crisis in regard to the production of hydrocarbons worldwide and their environmental impacts. Clearly, that is being utilized to increase automation, de-skill sectors of the working class and throwing them out. Clearly, it's directly related to the crisis that's currently taking place in the ability for folks to reproduce themselves within a capitalist mode of production. And where I want to go with this question from some of the prompts coming through online is exactly, I think, where Eleanor was taking us. How do we think about wildfires, food shortages, additional pandemics, maybe a fifth, sixth, seventh, infinite return of COVID? And part of the reason I asked this is yesterday I was traveling through Mid-Willamette Valley, Oregon. I represent healthcare workers currently in this crisis. I decided to leave the academy and join that struggle to see what I can contribute to it. And in doing so, and rushing off to a hospital where there had been a recent COVID outbreak and some union members are really struggling to survive there, we got rain for the first time in the Northwest for weeks and weeks and weeks. The biomass currently in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest in general is very dry. It's not just California, it's here as well. We're already starting to burn, and we expect that burning will continue. And as I was stuck in this rainstorm, in front of me was a number of old growth trees on a very clear logging truck. They had been burned on the side. There was no reason for these trees to be taken after a wildfire incident. In fact, they could have stood strong and stood for possibly dozens, if not hundreds of more years. So simply traveling to deal with the ongoing everyday struggles of working people in here in Oregon, I'm directly confronted both in the jubilee and hope that there's a rainstorm, and also the direct ecological apocalypse that is directly in front of me in the form of these old growth trees that could have stood strong for generations to come. So with that little caveat and story, I'm wondering, as Eleanor said, how are we planning for these next round of wildfires, which I expect will be outside my door in the coming days and coming weeks? How are we dealing with the water crises in the global south? And as we're thinking about planning for that, how do we make sure we're not caught on our back foot when these struggles erupt in the streets?
May I maybe tackle this one? Because set out the last round. Just kind of build. I want to just build off what I was saying before, but maybe a little bit more specificity. Is that like in these moments of crisis, when we do see these outward people coming out, when we talk about like say spontaneity, we also kind of talk about like decoding the hidden transcripts, if you will, like of society, and that anything that we look at as spontaneous usually has some type of social relations or social connections of interpersonal that are that exist below that. And by getting rooted in struggle, we can help see those systems and understand them. Those relationships already exist, relate to them, build connections, and then as conscious revolutionaries, not as like from above, but side by side, you know, like what Baptistas say, I forget the exact name, but something like walking side by side and learning. And then we can start to build like the struggles like tenants unions, lands back struggles, worker struggles, etc. So that when these next rounds of crisis hit, we've already started to build and scaffold some of that organization that we can then use. It's kind of repeating again, but it's because in the US, we just don't have a sufficient amount of that, or we're suffered by like localism, or even the biggest struggle is going on right now, like the biggest organization, Democratic Socialist America, I think it varies by locals, but you could, I think, could argue, say that there's still too much of a focus on electoral stuff. And from the electoral realm, it's like when we had all this stuff happen in Providence, for example, like we never had an official housing moratorium. I mean an official eviction moratorium. And we're like, all right, well, things are so bad here, maybe we'll get it. The crisis itself didn't make politicians act. So I think when these crises come, I think we have to think about it in the sense of creating a crisis in response to the crisis, so that we get a response from the crisis for the people in power. And so we both need to be able to create a crisis that they act, then also have enough organization and that's scaffolded and enough relationships built so we can respond to the immediate needs and kind of push that level of consciousness up, but also on the levels that we don't have the capacity. Like we, at the moment, the left couldn't do vaccine distribution. You know, sadly, we do need the state and things to do that, but we need to be able to create the environment that forces those people to do it. And that's not going to happen through electioneering or getting X amount of person in power. It happens once you build out autonomous power, that whoever's in power, they have to listen. And that's not to say I think elections have their place here and there, but it's the question isn't about that. It's about kind of building the power. So I think last point on that is, okay, base building, but base building sometimes can be slow. So we have to do that. So then, but when these times of crises happen and these waves happen, we have to find a way to capture that growth, as I mentioned before, and that's something we haven't been successful. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I think that those are some ways we can address it.
Anyone else? Feel free to jump in.
Something I want to throw out there that has just been on my mind a lot lately, and especially come up with the pandemic and seeing the kinds of interpersonal conflict just explode within households. And I think also on the left as well, we see this problem is that our society really struggles with dealing with healthy conflict. Someone in the chat, I don't know if he's still watching, but Greg asked about democratic confederalism, and I've been, worked closely various times with the Kurdish movement, and what they really do that's different from here, it isn't sort of structures or strategies or whatever. It's that they have a very, very different approach to working through conflict interpersonally and also internally. And again, I think to an American ear that can sound very woo-woo, But it's not, because what happens, you know, for example, when a crisis happens, there's a mutual aid project, there's a period of intensive work, and then it falls apart, and people struggle to deal with the emotional aspect of, you know, being under that pressure, the fear, the pain, the feeling unrecognized, that like really just healthy, starting to make healthy conflict resolution a part of our organizing culture is gonna, it's not the only thing that we need to do, but it's gonna help that give us more durability so that there's more networks intact the next time the next crisis comes.
Kai, Caitlin, Peter, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so just it's definitely supporting what Johnny and Eleanor both said. I mean, I just want to, you know, buttress that with one more example. In our book, in our disaster communism essay, we also draw on the work of Harry Cleaver in a classic essay that's called The Uses of an Earthquake, which I think everyone should also read. But similarly, what Cleaver finds is that in Mexico City post-earthquake organizing, you know, it wasn't just that there were spontaneous mutual aid networks that emerged, but those where people in apartment buildings, in this case in tenants organizations, had already had past experiences organizing with each other, that they more robustly were able to take a bigger step after that. And I think that that's, I mean, it can seem like a banal point, but it's actually a crucial one, because it is the, even in a failed struggle, even in a situation like DAPL, where we were unable to stop the pipeline, you're finding out the sorts of strategies that might work, building the connections of trust, and remaking yourselves as collective subjects in order to prepare yourself for the unknowable thing that's going to happen next. I think a similar situation can be seen on the streets of Minneapolis, where the revolutionary response to the murder of George Floyd didn't just emerge from nothing, but from 5 years of struggle, at least, against police violence in that city, emerging from past murders of Jamar Clark and Philando Castile and others, and our sorts of experiences, and other sorts of experiences about what worked, what didn't work, who they could trust, what institutions, where their weak points were, all of that kind of stuff. And it's unknowable to us what kinds of crises will happen, whether we'll see problems in food distribution, drought, fires, and, you know, social crises of various different kinds. You know, certainly we have no shortage of imagination for apocalypse, and I'm absolutely not going to say the quote that everyone expects now, and instead say that, like, part of what being prepared entails is just finding and building those kinds of robust connections and building them up in a kind of in a revolutionary way. So that's just reiterating what everyone else here has said. Fantastic.
Thank you, Guy. Wonderful. We're coming to the end here, so why don't we hear from Caitlin and then Peter, and we can move to close. Caitlin.
Well, I don't really think I have that much to add, so I'll keep it short. As I'm thinking of what everyone said, I second it. But I think, so an author, Elizabeth Wood, who was writing about the struggle in El Salvador, and she wrote that one of the reasons why people engaged in this, the revolutionary counter-hegemonic struggle was because there's the pleasure in coming together and changing unjust social structure through intentional action. And I think there's something very powerful in that, because amidst all the apocalypse, there is something powerful in the here and now that we're collectively building. We're building the new way. We're building community and finding strength in that comes on the heels of so many others before us and who will come after us.
Wonderful, Caitlin. A great transition to Peter.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody to go for the woo-woo, to quote Eleanor. She's referred to woo-woo, this new goddess, a couple times already, and I look forward to worshiping with her.
It's a word my mom uses for hippie stuff. I don't know if others use
yeah,
it.
I'm there with George Floyd. In the roads for traffic are turned into a sacred place in Minneapolis. We can do woo-woo all over. It's part of us. And what I would like to end my comments is with these Zapatistas, remind us that we're fighting a war against oblivion. And so I think all of your organizing is keep your own archive, so that we will remember and you will remember in years to come to treasure this. It's part of our battle against oblivion.
On that note, Peter, I hope people in the years to come turn to this archive of our conversation and can draw on it for their own struggles. And want to thank Common Notions for hosting. You can pick up both the collective titles at commonnotions.org. Continue to support and sustain Common Notions efforts as more of these events are being planned for the summer and spring. And I look forward to being back here with all the panelists and those who've joined us today and into the future by watching and listening and hopefully learning from our conversation. So move to close. Thank you all.